The cruelest lies are not the ones strangers tell. They're the ones spoken by the people you trust the most. The church stood beneath a gray November sky, its stained glass windows catching the last traces of afternoon light as mourners filled every pew. The air smelled faintly of lilies and candle wax. Soft piano music drifted through the sanctuary, barely louder than the quiet rustle of black coats and whispered condolences. At the front of the room rested a polished mahogany casket surrounded by white roses. Inside it lay Naomi Carter Whitmore. She was only 38 years old. Ethan Whitmore stood in the second row with his hands folded tightly in front of him. His tailored black suit fit perfectly, his posture remained straight, and from a distance he looked like a man completely in control. That illusion disappeared the moment someone looked into his eyes. There was no grief there, no tears, no heartbreak, only a strange emptiness, the kind that comes from years of carrying resentment until it becomes part of who you are. Around him, members of Chicago's business elite filled the church. CEOs, investors, politicians, and reporters occupied nearly every seat. They had come because Ethan Whitmore was one of the most powerful men in the city, founder of Whitmore Technologies, a billionaire, a man whose name appeared regularly on magazine covers and financial news broadcasts. Yet despite all his success, today he stood alone. His mother, Margaret Whitmore, sat quietly beside him. Her silver hair was perfectly arranged. Her expression was composed. She occasionally reached over and squeezed her son's arm with practiced sympathy. Every gesture appeared loving. Every glance appeared maternal. Ethan appreciated her presence more than he would ever admit. After all, she had been the one constant through everything. Through the collapse of his marriage. Through the years of silence. Through Naomi's departure from his life. At least that was what he believed. A minister stepped toward the podium and began speaking about Naomi's kindness, her generosity, her devotion to others. Ethan listened without really hearing. The words floated past him like distant echoes. Kind, compassionate, selfless. The descriptions felt disconnected from the woman he remembered, or perhaps the woman he had convinced himself she was. 7 years earlier, Naomi had walked away from their marriage. At least that was the story Ethan told himself whenever memories surfaced. She had stopped fighting, stopped explaining, stopped calling. Eventually, she had disappeared altogether. The years that followed hardened him. Whenever regret tried to emerge, Margaret always reminded him of the reasons he had let Naomi go. The suspicious messages, the unanswered questions, the secrets. Over time, those memories became facts in his mind. Facts he never questioned. The piano music faded. More speakers approached the podium. Friends shared stories. Co-workers described Naomi's volunteer work. A former teacher spoke through tears about scholarships Naomi had quietly funded for struggling students. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. None of it matched the image he carried. The disconnect irritated him more than it should have. Then movement near the aisle caught his attention. A small boy entered the sanctuary holding the hand of an older man. The room seemed to pause as they walked toward the front. Ethan immediately recognized the child. Elijah, his son, 6 years old now, taller than Ethan remembered. His dark curls were neatly combed. He wore a small black suit and carried himself with a seriousness no child should have to learn. Ethan had not seen him in nearly 5 years. The sight hit harder than he expected. Elijah never looked toward him. Not once. He simply continued walking until he reached the front row. The older man guiding him appeared to be Naomi's attorney. Ethan watched the boy sit down. The distance between them was less than 20 feet, yet it felt immeasurable. A hollow sensation settled in his chest. Before he could examine it, Elijah suddenly turned his head. Their eyes met for the first time. Ethan expected confusion, curiosity, maybe even anger. Instead, he saw certainty, the kind that belonged in someone much older. Elijah held his gaze for several seconds before speaking quietly. His voice was soft, but in the silence of the church it carried farther than he intended. Mom said one day you'd finally hear the truth. Ethan froze. The words landed with unexpected force. Several nearby guests glanced toward the child. Margaret immediately stiffened beside him. Her fingers tightened around her purse. Ethan frowned. What did he say? He whispered. Margaret quickly leaned closer. He's grieving, she said gently. Children say things they don't understand. Ethan nodded automatically, but something felt wrong. Across the sanctuary, Elijah continued staring at him. There was no accusation in his eyes, No hostility, only certainty, as though he already knew something Ethan did not. The minister resumed speaking, and the moment passed. Yet Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the room itself had changed. Minutes later, another unusual detail caught his attention. Near the casket, resting beside a framed photograph of Naomi, sat an old silver cell phone. It looked outdated, almost forgotten by time. A few guests noticed it and exchanged confused looks. Why would a broken phone be displayed at a funeral? Ethan studied it from across the room. Something about its presence seemed deliberate, important. He glanced toward Naomi's attorney. The older man stood quietly beside Elijah, watching the service unfold with calm patience, almost as if he were waiting for something, almost as if the funeral itself was only the beginning. And for the first time since entering the church, Ethan felt a small crack form in the story he had believed for 7 long years. The service continued, but Ethan heard very little after Elijah's words. The minister's voice rose and fell like distant waves, blending into the soft hum of the heating vents and the occasional creak of wooden pews. His attention kept drifting toward the front row where his son sat perfectly still. Elijah looked so much like Naomi that it was unsettling. The same calm eyes, the same quiet composure, the same habit of listening more than speaking. Ethan had spent years convincing himself that distance was necessary. Necessary for healing. Necessary for moving forward. Yet now, seeing the boy only a few yards away, those justifications suddenly felt fragile. Beside him, Margaret adjusted her black gloves and leaned closer. "You should not take what he said seriously," she whispered. "Children repeat things adults put into their heads." Ethan nodded automatically, but the explanation did not settle his unease. Across the room, Naomi's attorney remained standing near the casket. His name was Charles Bennett. Ethan remembered meeting him years ago during happier times when Naomi was organizing scholarship programs across the city. Charles had always been professional, reserved, and fiercely loyal to Naomi. Even now, there was something deliberate about the way he carried himself. He did not appear like a grieving friend attending a funeral. He looked like a man waiting for a specific moment to arrive. The service moved forward. A former co-worker spoke about Naomi's dedication to mentoring young women entering the workforce. A pastor from a local community center described how Naomi had quietly funded food programs during difficult winters. Story after story painted a picture Ethan barely recognized. Every speaker described someone generous, patient, and compassionate. It should not have bothered him. Instead, it made him uncomfortable. If they were right, then perhaps he had been wrong about more than he wanted to admit. His gaze drifted once more toward the silver cell phone near the framed photograph. The device seemed oddly out of place among the flowers and candles. It was not decorative. It was not sentimental. It felt purposeful. A question formed in his mind. Why would Naomi want an outdated phone displayed beside her casket? Before he could dwell on it further, Charles finally stepped forward. The room gradually fell silent. Even the faint whispers stopped. Charles adjusted the microphone and looked out over the congregation. His expression remained calm, but his eyes carried unusual weight. "Thank you all for being here today," he began. Naomi cared deeply about many people in this room. Before her passing, she left specific instructions regarding today's service. A ripple of curiosity moved through the crowd. Ethan straightened slightly. Margaret's posture became noticeably rigid. Charles continued. "Most of those instructions were personal. However, there is one request Naomi insisted must be honored publicly." The church seemed to grow quieter. Charles glanced toward Elijah. The boy gave a small nod. It was the kind of silent understanding that suggested this moment had been discussed many times beforehand. Ethan felt tension gather in his chest. Charles carefully picked up the silver cell phone from beside the photograph. Several guests exchanged confused looks. The attorney held the device gently, almost reverently. 7 years ago, he said, this phone became very important to Naomi. She asked that it remain sealed until today. Ethan frowned. 7 years ago. The number immediately caught his attention because it matched the year everything had fallen apart. The year his marriage ended. The year Naomi disappeared from his life. Charles pressed a button on the side of the phone. Nothing happened at first. Then a faint light appeared on the screen. Margaret suddenly inhaled sharply. It was subtle, so subtle most people would never have noticed. Ethan noticed. He turned toward her. "Mother," he asked quietly, "are you all right?" She forced a smile. "Of course." Yet her voice sounded strained. For the first time all afternoon, she seemed genuinely nervous. Charles placed the phone on the podium. "There are messages stored here," he said. Naomi instructed that they not be played until her funeral because she believed timing matters. She believed some truths can only be heard when people are finally ready to listen. The words landed heavily throughout the sanctuary. Ethan's pulse quickened. He did not understand why. He only knew that every instinct told him something significant was about to happen. Charles reached toward the screen, but paused. Before pressing play, he looked directly at Ethan. Not with hostility, not with accusation, simply with the solemn expression of a man carrying out a promise. "Mr. Whitmore," he said softly, his voice carrying through the silence. "What happens next is exactly what Naomi wanted." The room became utterly still. Ethan felt every eye shifting between him, the attorney, and the small silver phone resting beneath the church lights. Then, from the front row, Elijah finally spoke again. His voice was barely above a whisper, yet somehow everyone heard it. "Mom said Dad would not believe her when she was alive." The boy lowered his gaze, so she made sure he could hear her after she was gone. No one moved. No one coughed. Even the faint sounds of the city beyond the church walls seemed to disappear. Ethan stared at the silver phone resting on the podium as though it had suddenly become the most important object in the world. Charles Bennett lowered his eyes toward the screen and pressed a single button. A soft crackle filled the speakers overhead. For a moment, there was only static. Then a familiar voice emerged. Naomi's voice. Warm, gentle, unmistakable. The sound hit Ethan with such force that he forgot to breathe. 7 years vanished in an instant. Every memory he had spent years burying came rushing back. The way she laughed during long drives. The way she hummed while making coffee in the mornings. The way she always paused before answering difficult questions because she wanted to choose kindness over anger. Around the sanctuary, people exchanged stunned looks. Some covered their mouths. Others lowered their heads. Elijah sat perfectly still. It was obvious he had heard this recording before. "If you are hearing this," Naomi's voice said softly, "then I am gone, and there are things I never had the chance to say." The room remained frozen. Ethan felt his chest tighten. Margaret looked toward the floor. Naomi continued. "First, I want to thank everyone who loved me, supported me, and helped raise my son into the remarkable little boy he is becoming. Elijah, if you are listening, I hope you always remember that you were the greatest gift of my life." Several people wiped tears from their eyes. Elijah swallowed hard, but remained composed. Then Naomi's tone shifted slightly. Not bitter, not angry, simply honest. "There is someone else who needs to hear this message." Ethan felt every muscle in his body tense. Naomi paused briefly before speaking again. "Ethan." The sound of his name seemed to echo through the sanctuary. "I know this may be difficult for you. I know you probably have questions. But before you listen to anyone else, before you decide what is true and what is not, I need you to remember something. There was a time when we trusted each other completely." Ethan lowered his gaze. Images flooded his mind. A small apartment before the success. Shared dinners. Long conversations that stretched past midnight. Dreams they built together before money complicated everything. Naomi's voice continued. "Do you remember our first winter in Chicago? The apartment heater barely worked. We wore coats indoors and laughed every time snow came through the old window frame. We were not rich. We were not powerful. But we were happy." A faint smile appeared on several faces throughout the church. Even Ethan remembered that winter. He remembered Naomi dancing around the kitchen wearing thick socks while snow piled outside. He remembered believing they could survive anything together. The memory hurt more than he expected. "I am telling you this because I do not want the last 7 years to erase the years that came before them," Naomi said. "People change. Circumstances change. But some truths deserve to survive." Ethan slowly lifted his eyes toward the casket. For the first time that day, regret stirred beneath the numbness he had carried for years. Naomi continued speaking. "When things began falling apart between us, I kept hoping we would find our way back to each other. I believed misunderstandings could be fixed. I believed love was stronger than suspicion." Margaret shifted in her seat. The movement was small but noticeable. Charles remained silent beside the podium. He did not interrupt. He simply allowed Naomi's voice to fill the church. "Maybe that was my mistake," she said gently. "Maybe I waited too long. Maybe I believed the people around us wanted the same things we wanted. Ethan frowned. Something about that sentence felt deliberate, carefully chosen, like a door beginning to open. Naomi took another breath. The recording captured every small sound, every moment of hesitation, every trace of emotion. "For years I wondered if you truly stopped loving me," she said. "I wondered whether I had imagined everything we built together. I wondered whether the distance between us had been my fault." Ethan closed his eyes. Those words struck deeper than anything before them, because he remembered wondering similar things. He remembered lying awake after the separation, convincing himself that Naomi had chosen another life, another future, another family. It had been easier than questioning the evidence he believed he had seen, easier than questioning the people he trusted. The church remained silent as Naomi spoke her next words. "Eventually, I learned something important. The truth does not disappear just because people stop listening to it." Charles looked toward Ethan, not accusingly, not triumphantly, simply waiting. Naomi's voice softened. "And that is why I left this phone behind." A ripple of unease moved through the congregation. Ethan felt it too. The message was changing direction. The memories were ending. Something else was coming. Something Naomi had spent years preserving. The recording continued. "Everything you are about to hear was saved for a reason. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted anyone punished. I saved it because one day Elijah would deserve answers. And because one day, Ethan, you would deserve the truth." Across the sanctuary, Margaret's face lost what little color remained. Ethan noticed. For the first time all afternoon, he truly noticed. And as Naomi's final words from the recording echoed through the church speakers, a cold feeling settled deep inside him. The first message was a memory. The next one is evidence. The sanctuary remained motionless. It felt as though the entire church had stopped breathing. Ethan stared at the silver phone while Charles pressed another button. A brief tone echoed through the speakers. Then a different recording began. The sound quality was rougher this time, as if it had been captured unexpectedly. Naomi's voice appeared first. Softer, nervous, younger. "Margaret, I do not understand why you are upset with me." Several people exchanged glances. Ethan immediately recognized his mother's voice when it answered. "Do not play innocent with me, Naomi." The words landed like ice across the room. Margaret's shoulders stiffened. Her eyes remained fixed forward. No one looked away. The recording continued. "I love your son," Naomi said. "I have never done anything to hurt him." A short silence followed. Then Margaret laughed quietly. It was not a warm laugh. It was the sound of someone dismissing another person's feelings. "Love is not always enough," she replied. "Women like you never understand that." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. He had never heard this conversation before. He was certain of it. Naomi spoke again. "Women like me?" Another pause. Then Margaret answered. "You are emotional, idealistic. You distract him. Ethan was destined for much bigger things than this family life you keep pushing him toward." A murmur spread through the congregation. Charles remained silent beside the podium. Elijah lowered his eyes. The recording continued. "He wants a family too," Naomi said quietly. "He told me that himself." Margaret responded immediately. "He thinks he does." Ethan could barely process what he was hearing. The confidence in his mother's voice sounded nothing like the loving concern she had always presented. The conversation carried on. Naomi remained respectful, patient, calm. Margaret sounded increasingly irritated. "You are holding him back," she said. "Every hour he spends worrying about your feelings is an hour he should be building his company." Ethan's chest felt heavier with every sentence. The recording suddenly ended. The church remained silent. Charles allowed several seconds to pass before speaking. That conversation occurred 8 years ago. He looked toward the congregation. It was one of dozens Naomi saved. Ethan slowly turned toward his mother. Margaret kept her eyes forward. "Mother," he whispered. She did not answer. Charles pressed another button. A second recording began. This one sounded different. There was background noise. Traffic. Wind. The distant sound of a city street. Naomi's voice came first. "I received another email today." Her tone sounded exhausted. "Another message claiming Ethan is seeing someone else." Ethan frowned immediately. He remembered those months. Anonymous emails had appeared constantly. Screenshots. Rumors. Suggestions that Naomi was hiding things from him and that he was hiding things from her. They had poisoned every conversation, every disagreement. Margaret's voice appeared again. "Maybe there is truth in them." Naomi sighed. "You know there is not." Margaret responded without hesitation. Then why are you worried? The recording paused briefly before Naomi answered. Because someone keeps sending them. Ethan felt a chill move through him. The memory returned instantly. Hundreds of messages. Anonymous accounts. Mysterious screenshots. Strange tips that somehow always arrived at the perfect moment to create doubt. At the time, he had blamed Naomi for becoming distant. Naomi's voice continued. I just want peace. Margaret replied softly. Too softly. Sometimes peace requires sacrifice. Ethan closed his eyes. Something about that sentence felt familiar. He had heard it before. Many times. Throughout his marriage. Throughout the separation. Throughout the years afterward. Another silence filled the church as the recording ended. This time people openly stared at Margaret. Her face remained composed, but the confidence she carried earlier was beginning to crack. Charles picked up a folder from the podium. There is more, he said quietly. Much more. Ethan looked at him. How much more? His voice sounded weaker than he intended. Charles met his eyes. 7 years' worth. The answer settled over the sanctuary like a storm cloud. Ethan felt his pulse accelerating. 7 years. 7 years of recordings. 7 years of evidence. 7 years Naomi had preserved while he believed she had simply walked away. Charles opened the folder. Inside were printed pages. Emails. Call logs. Notes. Records. He did not show them yet. He simply held them in his hands. Naomi spent years documenting what was happening around her, he said. Not because she wanted a fight. Because she feared nobody would believe her. Ethan's gaze drifted toward the casket. For the first time since arriving, the resentment he carried began giving way to something far more painful. Doubt. Deep, unsettling doubt. Across the room, Elijah finally looked up. His eyes met Ethan's again. This time there was sadness in them. Not anger. Not judgment. Just sadness. The kind a child carries when he knows a truth an adult has spent years avoiding. Then Charles reached toward the phone once more. The next recording, he said softly, is the one Naomi believed would change everything. The silence inside the church felt heavier than before. It was no longer the respectful silence of mourning. It was the silence that comes moments before a truth changes everything. Charles Bennett stood beside the podium with one hand resting on the silver phone. Ethan could hear the faint ticking of the clock mounted near the rear wall. Every second seemed louder than the last. Margaret remained motionless beside him. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap. Her expression remained composed, but the confidence she carried earlier had faded. Charles looked down at the screen before pressing play once again. A soft tone echoed through the speakers. Then another recording began. This time Naomi sounded exhausted. Not physically exhausted. Emotionally exhausted. The kind of weariness that comes from trying to explain the same truth over and over without being heard. Today was the 4th time this month Ethan canceled dinner with me, she said quietly. There was a rustling sound in the background, as if she were recording the message while sitting alone at a table. He says work is demanding. Maybe it is. But something feels different. Every conversation turns into an argument. Every misunderstanding grows larger than it should. Ethan lowered his eyes. He remembered those months. The company had been expanding rapidly. Investors demanded constant attention. New offices were opening. He had convinced himself that success required sacrifice. Naomi continued. I keep trying to reach him. I keep trying to understand what changed. Every time I think we are making progress, another problem appears. The recording paused briefly. Then her voice became softer. Sometimes I feel like someone is standing between us. Several people exchanged uneasy glances. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Charles allowed the recording to continue. Last week, Ethan asked me about an email I never received. The week before that, he confronted me about a message I never sent. Yesterday, he was upset because I missed a lunch meeting that I never knew existed. Naomi released a tired breath. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Now I am not so sure. Ethan closed his eyes. Memories surfaced instantly. Missed meetings. Confusing conversations. Countless misunderstandings that seemed impossible to explain. At the time, he had blamed Naomi's growing distance. He had never stopped to question how those misunderstandings kept appearing. Naomi continued speaking. I still love him. I know that sounds foolish after everything lately, but I do. I believe the man I married is still there somewhere beneath the frustration and doubt. Her voice cracked slightly. I just do not know how to reach him anymore. The recording ended. No one spoke. Ethan felt something painful pressing against his chest. It was not anger. It was guilt, deep and unfamiliar. Charles waited several moments before opening the folder again. He removed a printed document and held it up. "This is a phone log from 6 years ago," he explained. "It shows 32 unanswered calls Naomi placed to Ethan over a 3-month period." Ethan frowned immediately. "That cannot be right." His voice echoed through the sanctuary. Every head turned toward him. Charles met his gaze calmly. "Why not?" Ethan stood slowly. "Because I never received 32 calls from Naomi." The words left his mouth before he could stop them. Charles nodded as though he had expected that response. "Exactly." A chill moved through the room. Charles lowered the document. "The records show the calls were made. The question is why they never reached you." Ethan stared at him. His pulse quickened. Across the sanctuary, Elijah remained silent, watching everything unfold. Charles removed another page from the folder. "This document shows dozens of emails Naomi sent during the same period." Ethan shook his head. "I never saw them." Charles nodded again. "That is also what Naomi believed." Margaret suddenly shifted in her seat. The movement was small, but everyone noticed. Charles carefully placed the papers back into the folder. Then he reached for the phone once more. The next recording was made 4 days after Naomi discovered something important. Ethan felt his heartbeat accelerate. Charles looked directly at him. It was the moment she stopped believing the problems in her marriage were accidental. The church grew silent once more. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the stained glass windows. Inside, every eye remained fixed on the podium. Charles pressed play. Naomi's voice returned. This time there was no confusion in it. No uncertainty. Only quiet heartbreak. "Today I learned that some people do not destroy a marriage by shouting," she said softly. "They destroy it one missing message at a time." The recording continued, and the rain outside seemed to grow heavier against the stained glass windows. Naomi's voice remained steady, but beneath it lived a sadness that no longer tried to hide. 3 days ago, I accidentally discovered something I was never supposed to see. I was not searching for answers. I was looking for a recipe Margaret promised to email me. Instead, I found copies of messages." The church remained silent. Ethan felt his heartbeat pounding inside his ears. Naomi continued. "At first I thought I was confused. Then I saw more. Messages forwarded from one account to another. Emails edited before being sent. Conversations missing entire sections. Dates changed. Names removed." Ethan slowly lowered his head. Across the sanctuary, several guests exchanged stunned glances. Naomi took a slow breath. "I spent 2 years believing my marriage was failing because Ethan and I could not communicate. I blamed myself. I blamed stress. I blamed work. I blamed bad timing. I never imagined someone was quietly standing between us." Charles stood motionless beside the podium. Margaret stared forward without speaking. The recording continued. "The hardest part was not discovering what happened. The hardest part was realizing why." Another pause followed. Then Naomi spoke words that seemed to settle over every person in the room. "Some people are so afraid of losing control that they would rather destroy something beautiful than allow it to grow beyond them." Ethan felt a chill travel through his body. He remembered dozens of conversations with his mother over the years. Advice, warnings, concerns presented as love, questions presented as protection. Each memory now felt different. Distorted. Naomi continued. "I wanted to confront Margaret immediately. I wanted to demand answers. But I knew nobody would believe me without proof. Especially Ethan." The sentence landed harder than anything before it. Ethan closed his eyes. She was right. 7 years ago, he would not have believed her. Not completely. Not over his mother. The realization felt like a weight pressing against his chest. The recording shifted. A faint sound of footsteps echoed in the background. Then another voice appeared. Margaret's voice. The church immediately became still again. The recording had clearly been captured during a private conversation. Naomi spoke first. "Why are you doing this?" There was no anger in her voice. Only heartbreak. Margaret answered calmly. "Because someone has to protect him." Naomi sounded exhausted. "Protect him from what?" A short silence followed. Then Margaret replied. "From making permanent mistakes." Several people in the congregation visibly reacted. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Naomi answered quietly. "You are talking about me like I am a problem to solve." Margaret did not deny it. "You were never right for his future." The words echoed through the sanctuary. Naomi remained silent for several seconds. When she finally spoke again, her voice sounded smaller. Hurt. I love him. Margaret responded immediately. That is exactly why you are dangerous. Ethan opened his eyes and stared at the floor. He could barely recognize the woman whose voice filled the speakers. This was not the caring mother who comforted him after the separation. This was someone else entirely. Someone he had never allowed himself to see. The recording continued. You intercepted our messages. Naomi's voice trembled slightly. You manipulated conversations. You made us doubt each other. Margaret released a long sigh. You give me too much credit. Naomi answered without hesitation. Did you do it? The silence that followed felt endless. Then Margaret spoke. I did what was necessary. A collective gasp moved through the church. Several people covered their mouths. Others stared openly at Margaret. Ethan felt as though the air had vanished from the room. He had spent years defending his mother, years believing her version of events, years blaming Naomi for things he now could not even fully remember. The recording continued. Naomi's voice cracked. You destroyed my marriage. Margaret's answer came cold and certain. No, I saved my son from a life he would eventually regret. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. Every memory he carried suddenly felt unstable. Every certainty seemed fragile. The recording ended abruptly. The sanctuary remained frozen. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the rain tapping softly against the windows. Charles finally looked up from the phone. His expression carried no satisfaction, only sadness. That recording was made 6 years ago, he said quietly. Naomi kept it hidden because she hoped reconciliation was still possible. Ethan slowly turned toward his mother. For the first time in his life, he did not know who she was. Margaret remained silent. Her eyes stayed fixed ahead, but the calm mask she had worn throughout the service was beginning to crack. And somewhere deep inside Ethan, something far more painful than grief was beginning to awaken. It was the terrifying realization that the person he had trusted most might be the very reason he lost the person he loved most. For several long seconds, Ethan could not move. The church around him seemed distant, blurred by the storm raging inside his mind. Every memory he trusted now felt contaminated. Every conversation with Naomi replayed differently. He remembered the arguments, the confusion, the nights when she looked at him with hurt in her eyes while he stood convinced he was the one being deceived. He remembered her asking him to listen, asking him to trust her, asking for one more chance to explain. And he remembered walking away. Across the sanctuary, Elijah remained seated in the front row, his small hands folded tightly together. The boy looked older than his years, not because of his appearance, but because of the quiet sadness he carried so naturally. Ethan found himself staring at his son. 6 years old. 6 years he could never get back. 6 years of birthdays missed. School events missed. Conversations missed. Moments that belonged to fathers and sons. Moments that now existed only in photographs and memories he had never shared. Charles carefully closed the folder in his hands. There is something important you need to understand, he said quietly. His voice echoed gently through the sanctuary. Naomi never intended for these recordings to be used against anyone. Margaret finally looked up. Her expression was strained now. Defensive. Then why play them? She asked. It was the first time she had spoken since the recordings began. Her voice sounded weaker than usual. Charles met her gaze calmly. Because she knew the truth would never survive without evidence. The answer settled heavily over the congregation. Margaret looked away. Ethan watched her closely. For years he had viewed his mother as a source of certainty. The person who always seemed to know what was best. The person who stayed when everyone else left. Yet sitting there now, he realized something painful. He had spent years asking whether Naomi had betrayed him. He had never once asked whether someone else had betrayed them both. Charles reached for another document. There is one detail Naomi wanted Ethan to hear before the next recording. Ethan slowly lifted his head. Charles unfolded a single sheet of paper. 5 years ago, after the separation, Naomi hired a private investigator. A murmur moved through the church. Ethan frowned. That information surprised him. Naomi had never been vindictive, never interested in revenge. Charles continued. She did not hire the investigator to expose anyone publicly. She hired him because she wanted proof before she approached Ethan again. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Approached me, he asked quietly. Charles nodded. She intended to show you everything. The The room fell silent once more. Ethan stared at him. Then why did she not? Charles looked down briefly. The sadness in his eyes deepened. Because every time she tried to reach you, something happened. Ethan felt cold. Charles opened the folder again and removed several printed pages. These are visitor logs from Whitmore Technologies. Ethan immediately recognized the format. Executive security records. Charles held up the first page. Naomi came to your office 3 separate times during the first year after your separation. Ethan blinked. No. Charles nodded. Yes. He placed the page down and lifted another. She left letters. Another page. Requested meetings. Another page. Waited in the lobby for hours on 2 occasions. Ethan stared at the documents. His mind struggled to process the information. He had never seen those requests. Never received those letters. Never been informed she visited. The realization struck with devastating clarity. Someone had made sure he never knew. Charles looked directly at him. According to witness statements, every request was intercepted before reaching you. Ethan slowly turned toward his mother. Margaret remained silent. The church seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the rain continued falling against the windows. Inside, the distance between mother and son suddenly felt larger than the entire sanctuary. Charles pressed another button on the silver phone. A new recording began. Naomi's voice returned, softer than before. Tired, heartbroken, yet still dignified. Today I sat in the lobby of Ethan's building for 3 hours. A painful silence followed. I watched people come and go. I watched employees laugh together. I watched the elevator doors open and close. I kept hoping someone would tell him I was there. Ethan lowered his head. Naomi continued. Eventually a receptionist approached me. She was kind. She looked embarrassed. She told me Mr. Whitmore was unavailable. Her voice trembled slightly. The strange thing was that I never asked to see Mr. Whitmore. I only asked whether he received my letter. The church remained silent as her words echoed through the speakers. Then came the sentence that made Ethan close his eyes. That was the moment I realized someone was answering questions I never asked. The recording ended, but its impact lingered like a shadow across the sanctuary. Ethan remained standing beside the pew, unable to sit, unable to think clearly. Every new piece of information felt like another crack spreading through the foundation of his past. He had spent years believing Naomi abandoned their marriage. Now he was discovering that she had spent those same years trying to reach him, trying to save what remained, trying to be heard. Charles allowed the silence to settle before speaking again. There is one chapter of Naomi's story that none of you know. His voice was calm, measured, and filled with quiet sorrow. She specifically asked that it be shared today. Ethan looked up slowly. Across the room, Elijah sat with his eyes fixed on the floor. The boy already knew what was coming. That realization alone made Ethan's chest tighten. Charles pressed another button on the silver phone. A new recording began. Naomi's voice sounded different this time. Weaker. Not emotionally weaker, but physically tired. I am recording this from a hospital parking garage. The room immediately became still. Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken. Naomi continued. Do not worry. Nothing dramatic happened today. The doctors are optimistic. They always tell me that. A faint attempt at humor crossed her voice before fading. I suppose they have to. Several people exchanged confused glances. Ethan frowned. Hospital? He had no memory of Naomi ever being seriously ill. Naomi took a slow breath. I promised myself I would not spend these recordings talking about sadness. I wanted them to be about truth. But sometimes the truth is sad. The rain continued tapping softly against the stained glass windows. Naomi's voice filled every corner of the sanctuary. 3 months ago, I received a diagnosis. Ethan felt his stomach drop. He suddenly understood where this recording was leading. Around him, several guests lowered their heads. Naomi continued. When I first heard the news, I did not think about myself. I thought about Elijah. I thought about all the things I still wanted to teach him. How to ride a bike without fear. How to be kind when the world rewards cruelty. How to forgive people who do not deserve it. Elijah squeezed his hands together. Ethan could barely breathe. And then I thought about Ethan. The mention of his name felt different now. Not accusatory. Not bitter. Simply honest. For years I imagined what I would say if we ever spoke again. Sometimes I imagined being angry. Sometimes I imagined demanding answers. But when you learn that time may be shorter than you expected, anger begins to feel very small. Ethan lowered his eyes. The words cut deeper than any accusation could have. Naomi continued. I wanted him to know about the diagnosis. Not because I expected anything from him. Not because I wanted sympathy. I simply believed he deserved the truth. Charles quietly opened another section of the folder. During the following 6 months, he said, Naomi attempted to contact Ethan 19 separate times. Ethan closed his eyes. 19 times. Charles continued. Phone calls, letters, messages delivered through attorneys. Every attempt was documented. The room remained silent. Ethan slowly turned toward Margaret. She refused to meet his gaze. Naomi's recording continued. At first I thought he was ignoring me. Then I remembered something important. Every time I tried to reach Ethan during our marriage, the message somehow disappeared. Every time I asked a question, the answer never arrived. Eventually patterns become impossible to ignore. Her voice grew softer. So I stopped asking whether Ethan wanted to hear from me. I started asking who was making sure he never did. A chill moved through the sanctuary. Charles removed a sealed envelope from the folder. The paper had aged slightly around the edges. This letter was addressed to Ethan 3 years ago, he explained. It was never delivered. Ethan stared at the envelope. His own name was written across the front in Naomi's handwriting. The sight nearly broke him. Charles carefully unfolded the letter. I will not read the entire thing, he said quietly. Only one passage. The church remained completely still. Charles looked down at the page and read aloud. Dear Ethan, if you are reading this, then somehow my words finally reached you. I do not know whether we will ever agree about the past. I do not know whether we will ever speak again. But I need you to know one thing. I never stopped believing there was goodness in you. Even when you stopped believing in me. Ethan felt tears gathering for the first time that day. He did not try to hide them. Charles lowered the letter. Naomi's voice returned through the speakers. If you never hear this message, I hope Elijah does. Because he deserves to know that love is not measured by who stays when things are easy. Love is measured by who keeps hoping even after their heart is broken. The recording paused briefly. Then Naomi spoke words that caused Charles to close his eyes. The next file contains the answer I spent 7 years searching for. It contains the moment I finally learned exactly how my messages disappeared. The rain outside had softened into a steady whisper, but inside the sanctuary the tension only grew heavier. No one shifted in their seat. No one reached for a phone. The entire room seemed suspended between the past and the truth that was still unfolding. Ethan stared at the silver phone on the podium as Charles pressed play once more. A brief crackle filled the speakers. Then Naomi's voice returned. It sounded calmer than before. Not because she felt peace, but because she had finally found certainty. I spent years wondering how messages disappeared. I spent years questioning my memory, my judgment, even my sanity. Eventually, I stopped asking whether it was happening. I started asking how. Ethan felt his hands tremble slightly. Naomi continued. 3 years ago, I received an unexpected phone call from someone who used to work at Whitmore Technologies. Charles quietly opened another folder and removed a business card. The caller was a former executive assistant, he explained. She resigned shortly after these events occurred. Naomi's voice continued through the speakers. At first, she was afraid to speak. She said she carried guilt for years. She said she watched things happen that never felt right. The sanctuary remained silent. Ethan remembered dozens of employees from that period. Faces blurred together after so many years. Yet a growing part of him already knew where this was leading. Naomi took a slow breath. The assistant told me that certain instructions were given regarding my communication with Ethan. Specific instructions. Margaret's eyes closed briefly. It was only for a moment, but Ethan noticed. Charles looked toward the congregation. The woman provided a sworn statement. He held up a document. The statement was verified and legally recorded. Ethan felt his pulse accelerating. Naomi's voice returned. According to her, letters addressed to Ethan were redirected before reaching his office. Calls were filtered. Meeting requests were denied. Messages were labeled as unnecessary. A stunned silence swept through the church. Ethan lowered his head. Every explanation he had spent years searching for was suddenly appearing one piece at a time. Naomi continued. When I asked who authorized these decisions, she gave me a name. The recording paused. Even the rain seemed to disappear. Margaret Whitmore. Several people gasped quietly. Ethan did not react. He could not. The truth felt too large to absorb all at once. Charles carefully placed the statement on the podium. There is more. His voice remained calm. The assistant also kept emails. Ethan looked up sharply. Emails. Real records. Not rumors. Not assumptions. Evidence. Charles pressed another button. A different voice filled the sanctuary. It belonged to a woman in her 40s. Professional. Nervous. My name is Rachel Simmons. I worked as an executive assistant at Whitmore Technologies for 6 years. The recording quality was clear. Every word carried through the church. I am providing this statement voluntarily because I believe Naomi Carter Whitmore deserves the truth. Ethan stared at the podium. Rachel Simmons. He remembered her immediately. Organized. Efficient. Quiet. Someone he trusted completely. The recording continued. Beginning approximately 7 years ago, I received instructions regarding communication between Naomi and Ethan. The instructions came from Margaret Whitmore. A wave of disbelief moved through the room. Rachel continued. At first I assumed there was a legitimate reason. Family matters. Privacy concerns. I did not ask questions. Eventually, I realized messages were being withheld without Ethan's knowledge. Ethan felt something inside him breaking apart. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. Quietly. Like a foundation collapsing beneath years of search. Margaret instructed me not to tell him. Ethan closed his eyes. The memory of that day returned instantly. He had spent the afternoon in his office reviewing contracts. Less than 3 floors above where Naomi waited. Less than 3 floors away from a conversation that might have changed everything. Rachel continued. That decision stayed with me for years. It is the reason I resigned. The recording ended. No one spoke. Ethan slowly turned toward his mother. This time Margaret could not avoid his gaze. For the first time all afternoon, fear appeared in her eyes. Real fear. Not fear of exposure. Fear of losing her son. Across the sanctuary, Elijah remained silent. Charles folded his hands and looked toward Ethan. Naomi spent years searching for proof, he said quietly. When she finally found it, she did not celebrate. Ethan swallowed hard. Charles lowered his eyes. Because by then she had already lost too much time. Then he reached once more for the silver phone. And what she discovered next was the reason she decided these recordings could not remain hidden forever. The sanctuary felt smaller now. The walls, the stained glass, the rows of mourners all seemed to close in around Ethan as the weight of the truth settled deeper into his chest. He remained standing beside the pew, unable to sit, unable to escape the growing realization that the life he thought he understood had been built on carefully hidden deceptions. Across the room, Elijah sat quietly beside Charles Bennett. The boy never looked triumphant, never looked vindicated. He simply looked tired, too tired for a child his age. Charles rested one hand on the silver phone and looked toward the congregation. The next recording was the last major discovery Naomi made before her health began to decline. His voice carried gently through the silence. It explains why she stopped trying to expose the truth publicly. Ethan swallowed hard. Part of him wanted the recordings to stop. Another part needed to hear every word. Charles pressed play. Naomi's voice returned. Softer now. Reflective. There is something strange about finally finding the answer to a question that has haunted you for years. You imagine it will bring relief, closure, peace. Instead, it often brings grief. The room remained still. Naomi continued. After I received Rachel's statement, I spent several weeks reviewing old documents. Old emails. Old letters. Old memories. I thought I was searching for proof. The truth is I was searching for understanding. Ethan lowered his eyes. He already knew what she meant. Facts alone could explain what happened. They could not explain why. Naomi took a slow breath. I kept asking myself the same question. Why would someone work so hard to keep two people apart? The recording paused briefly. Then she continued. Eventually, I stopped looking at what was done. I started looking at what was feared. Charles quietly folded his hands. Around the sanctuary, guests listened with complete attention. Naomi's voice grew more thoughtful. Fear can disguise itself as love. Fear can sound like protection. Fear can even convince itself that it is doing the right thing. Ethan slowly turned toward his mother. Margaret remained motionless. Her eyes were fixed on the floor. Naomi continued. I spent years believing I was fighting against cruelty. I was wrong. Cruelty would have been easier to understand. What I was really facing was fear. The words seemed to hang in the air. Fear of change. Fear of losing influence. Fear of becoming less important in someone's life. Ethan felt another painful memory surface. Countless times his mother had spoken about loyalty, family, obligation. Countless times she had warned him that success attracted the wrong people. He had never questioned why those warnings always seemed directed toward Naomi. The recording continued. 3 months after receiving Rachel's statement, I requested a private meeting. Several people exchanged glances. Ethan looked toward Charles. The attorney remained silent. Naomi continued. I met Margaret for coffee. Not to accuse her. Not to threaten her. I simply wanted to understand. A hush settled over the sanctuary. This was new information. Ethan had never known such a meeting occurred. Naomi's voice remained calm. We sat across from each other for nearly an hour. For most of that hour, neither of us discussed the past. We talked about Elijah, the weather, books, anything except the truth. Charles slowly reached into the folder and removed another recording device. Smaller than the phone. Older. Ethan stared at it. Naomi continued. Eventually, I asked her one question. The recording paused. Then Naomi repeated it. If you could go back and change everything, would you? The sanctuary became completely silent. Even the rain outside seemed to fade. Then another voice entered the recording. Margaret's voice. Older. Tired. Not defensive. Not angry. Just honest in a way Ethan had never heard before. No, she answered. A collective breath moved through the room. Naomi's voice followed quietly. Why not? Margaret's answer came after several seconds of silence. Because I was afraid of losing my son. Ethan felt tears gathering again. This time he did not fight them. The recording continued. I told myself I was protecting him. Then I told myself I was protecting our family. After a while I stopped knowing the difference. The honesty in her voice felt almost unbearable. Naomi asked another question. Do you regret it? The silence that followed stretched for several long seconds. Then Margaret answered softly. Every day. No one in the sanctuary moved. No one spoke. Ethan stared at his mother. She still had not looked up. Naomi's voice returned one final time. That conversation changed everything for me. Not because it excused what happened. Nothing could do that. But because I finally understood something important. She paused. The greatest tragedies are not always caused by hatred. Sometimes they are caused by fear left unchecked for too long. The recording ended. Charles looked toward Ethan. His expression carried deep sadness. Then he spoke quietly. There is only one recording left. And it is the one Naomi wanted Ethan to hear most. The church remained silent long after the recording ended. Ethan could hear nothing except the faint sound of rain and the uneven rhythm of his own breathing. The revelation should have brought relief. After years of confusion, he finally understood what had happened. Yet the truth felt nothing like freedom. It felt like loss. Loss measured not in days or months, but in years. Years that could never be recovered. Years Naomi had spent hoping for a conversation that never came. Years Elijah had spent growing up without a father who believed he had been abandoned. Charles Bennett stood quietly beside the podium. He waited until the silence settled before speaking. The final recording was made 12 days before Naomi passed away. Ethan slowly raised his eyes. 12 days. The number struck him harder than expected. It meant Naomi had been thinking about this moment almost until the very end. It meant she had known there was a chance Ethan would only hear her voice after she was gone. Charles rested a hand on the silver phone. She recorded it alone. The attorney paused briefly, and she asked that nothing interrupt it. No one moved. Even Margaret remained completely still. Charles pressed play. A soft crackle filled the speakers. Then Naomi's voice returned one last time. It sounded weaker than before, but there was something else in it now. Peace. Not happiness. Not satisfaction. Peace. The kind that comes from finally putting down a burden that has been carried too long. If you are hearing this, then my journey is over. Her words drifted gently through the sanctuary. And if you are hearing this, Ethan, then it means the truth finally reached you. Ethan closed his eyes. The sound of her voice felt both comforting and unbearable. Naomi continued. For years I imagined what I would say if I ever had the chance to speak to you again. I wrote letters, deleted them, recorded messages, started over. Nothing ever felt right. A small pause followed. Eventually I realized there are no perfect words for a broken heart. Several people quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Naomi continued. The strange thing is that I spent so much time hoping you would understand what happened that I almost forgot something important. Her voice softened. You were hurting too. Ethan felt a tear slide down his cheek. He did not wipe it away. Naomi continued. For a long time, I believed you chose not to believe me. Later, I learned you were never given the chance. The sanctuary remained motionless. That discovery changed everything. It forced me to stop viewing our story as a battle between good and bad people. It forced me to see something much more complicated. A family destroyed by fear. A marriage weakened by silence. Two people separated by lies neither of them created. Ethan lowered his head. Every word felt painfully true. Naomi continued. I do not know what you are feeling right now. Maybe anger. Maybe guilt. Maybe regret. But if there is one thing I need you to hear, it is this. Her voice grew firmer. Stronger. Do not spend the rest of your life punishing yourself. Ethan opened his eyes. Across the room, Elijah slowly looked toward the podium. Naomi continued. Regret can become another prison. And our family has already lost too many years to prisons built by fear. A long silence followed. Then she spoke the words that changed the entire room. The person who needs you most is not me. Ethan immediately looked toward his son. Naomi continued. It is Elijah. The little boy lowered his eyes. He carries questions that only you can answer. He carries dreams you have never heard. He carries pieces of both of us. Naomi's voice trembled slightly. Please do not let him grow up believing that love always arrives too late. Ethan felt something inside him break completely. Not from pain, from truth. Naomi continued. I spent years protecting him from bitterness. I never told him to hate you. I never told him you abandoned us. Because deep down, I believed there would come a day when you finally saw what I saw. Her next words barely rose above a whisper. The good man I fell in love with. Tears now streamed freely down Ethan's face. Around the sanctuary, many others were crying as well. Even Charles lowered his eyes. Naomi took a slow breath. There is one final thing I want to say. The room seemed to hold its breath. Forgiveness is not pretending something never happened. Forgiveness is choosing not to let pain write the ending. A pause followed. Then came her final words. Goodbye, Ethan. Take care of our son. And whenever you think of me, do not remember the years we lost. Remember the years we loved. The recording ended. The speakers fell silent. And for the first time since the funeral began, Ethan realized that the voice he had spent 7 years trying to forget had just given him the one thing he never believed he deserved, a second chance. No one spoke after the recording ended. The silence that filled the church was unlike any silence Ethan had ever experienced. It was not empty. It was full of memories, regrets, and truths that could no longer be ignored. Naomi's final words seemed to linger in the air long after the speakers had gone quiet. Take care of our son. The sentence repeated inside his mind again and again. Ethan slowly lowered himself onto the wooden pew. For the first time in years, he stopped fighting what he felt. The grief came all at once. Not only grief for Naomi, but grief for every missed birthday, every unanswered letter, every moment that should have belonged to their family. Across the sanctuary, Elijah remained seated in the front row. The boy stared at the photograph beside the casket. His small face was calm, yet Ethan could see the sadness hidden beneath that calmness. It was the same sadness Naomi had carried. The sadness of someone who kept hoping. Charles Bennett carefully turned off the silver phone and placed it beside the framed photograph. The device that had carried Naomi's voice now rested in silence. Its purpose was complete. Slowly, mourners began wiping tears from their eyes. Some looked toward Ethan with sympathy. Others looked toward Margaret with disappointment. No one seemed interested in blame anymore. The truth had already done what it needed to do. Margaret remained seated beside her son. Her shoulders looked smaller than before. The confident woman who had entered the church that afternoon seemed gone. In her place sat an elderly mother facing the consequences of choices she could never undo. After several minutes, she finally spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Ethan. He did not answer immediately. She swallowed hard. I never wanted this. Ethan stared ahead. The stained glass windows glowed softly as the late afternoon light filtered through them. But it happened, he said quietly. Margaret lowered her eyes. Tears gathered there. I thought I was protecting you. Ethan nodded once. I know. His answer surprised her. She looked at him. There was no anger in his voice. No shouting. No accusation. Only exhaustion. That is what makes it so tragic. Margaret covered her mouth as tears finally escaped. For years she had defended her choices. For years she had convinced herself they were necessary. Yet hearing her son speak those words seemed to break whatever remained of that certainty. Across the sanctuary, Elijah slowly stood from his seat. The movement caught Ethan's attention immediately. The boy looked toward Charles. The attorney gave a gentle nod. Then Elijah turned toward Ethan. For a moment, neither of them moved. Father and son stood separated by only a few rows of pews and nearly 7 years of silence. Ethan felt his heart pounding. He had negotiated billion-dollar contracts, spoken before thousands of shareholders, faced crises that could destroy entire companies. None of those moments felt as difficult as this one. Carefully, he stood. Elijah took a small step forward. Ethan took one as well. The church remained completely silent as everyone watched. When they finally stood only a few feet apart, neither seemed certain what to say. Ethan looked at his son, really looked at him. The dark curls, the thoughtful eyes, the quiet strength. Naomi was there in every detail. Tears filled Ethan's eyes again. "I am sorry," he whispered. The words sounded painfully small compared to everything that had happened. Elijah looked at him for several seconds. Then he asked the question Ethan feared most. "Did you really not know?" Ethan felt his chest tighten. He shook his head slowly. "No." The honesty in that single word echoed through the sanctuary. Elijah studied his face, searching, measuring, looking for something. Finally, he nodded. Not because everything was forgiven, not because the pain disappeared, simply because he believed the answer. Ethan released a shaky breath. Elijah glanced toward his mother's casket. Mom said the truth would find its way eventually. Ethan looked toward Naomi's photograph. Her smile seemed almost alive beneath the church lights. "She was right," he said softly. Elijah hesitated before taking one final step forward. Ethan instinctively knelt, so they stood at eye level. Then, without warning, Elijah wrapped his arms around him. Ethan closed his eyes and held his son tightly. Around them, quiet tears flowed through the sanctuary. Not because the pain was gone, not because the losses could be repaired, but because after years of silence, the first bridge had finally been rebuilt. And beneath the gentle glow of the stained glass light, beside the woman who had refused to let bitterness write the ending, a father and son took their first step toward becoming a family again. 1 year later, the city looked different to Ethan Whitmore. The skyline had not changed. The buildings still stretched into the clouds. The traffic still filled the streets each morning. The company he built continued growing. Investors still called. Reporters still requested interviews. Yet none of those things occupied the center of his life anymore. On a bright spring afternoon, Ethan stood beneath a clear blue sky in a neighborhood park on the north side of Chicago. Children laughed in the distance. Fresh green leaves moved gently in the breeze. Beside him, Elijah raced across a grassy field carrying a baseball glove nearly as large as his arm. "You missed it again," the boy shouted with a grin. Ethan laughed. A real laugh. One he had not heard from himself in years. "I am getting older," he called back. "That is a terrible excuse." Elijah immediately threw the ball again. Ethan caught it this time, and the boy raised both arms in celebration. The sound of his laughter filled the afternoon air. Ethan held the baseball in his hand for a moment and simply watched him. During the past year, they had rebuilt their relationship one small step at a time. There had been awkward conversations, difficult questions, long silences. There had also been movie nights, school projects, baseball games, science fairs, and Sunday breakfasts. No grand gesture repaired 7 years of absence. Only consistency could do that. And every day, Ethan chose to show up. Across town, another project had quietly taken shape. It occupied 3 floors inside a renovated brick building. Above the entrance hung a simple sign bearing 4 words, the Naomi Carter Center. The center provided educational support, mentoring programs, and family counseling services. Its mission was not built around tragedy. It was built around connection, helping families communicate before silence became distance, helping people listen before misunderstandings became permanent. Every room inside the building reflected something Naomi valued: kindness, opportunity, hope. Ethan never attached his own name to the project. He knew exactly whose legacy it honored. Later that afternoon, father and son drove to a small cemetery outside the city. They visited once every month, not out of obligation, out of love. Fresh flowers rested in the back seat beside Elijah. White roses, Naomi's favorite. The cemetery was quiet when they arrived. Sunlight filtered through tall trees as they walked together along a narrow path. Eventually, they reached the place they had come to see. Elijah carefully knelt and placed the flowers beside the headstone. Ethan stood silently nearby. The polished stone reflected the warm afternoon light. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Elijah smiled softly. "I got an A on my science project this week." Ethan looked down at him. The boy was speaking toward the grave as naturally as if Naomi were sitting beside them. "And Dad finally learned how to help with math homework without making everything more complicated." Ethan laughed quietly. "That is a slight exaggeration." Elijah grinned. "Not really." They stood together in comfortable silence. A year earlier, moments like this would have been impossible. Too painful. Too raw. Now they felt different. The loss remained. It always would. But it no longer consumed everything around it. Eventually, Elijah walked a few feet away to explore a nearby path. Ethan remained where he was, alone with his thoughts, alone with Naomi's memory. He looked down at the flowers and smiled sadly. "You were right," he said softly. The breeze moved gently through the trees. About all of it. His eyes drifted toward Elijah in the distance. The boy was examining a bird perched on a low branch. Curious, thoughtful, kind. So much like her. Ethan felt gratitude mixed with sorrow, a combination he had learned to live with. "I spent years wishing for another chance with you," he continued quietly. "What I did not realize was that you left me something even more important." He looked toward his son again. "You left me a chance to be his father." The afternoon sunlight warmed the stone beneath his hand. For a moment, Ethan remembered the final recording. The final words. "Do not remember the years we lost. Remember the years we loved." A year ago, those words felt impossible. Now he finally understood them. Love had not disappeared when the marriage ended. It had survived the misunderstandings, survived the distance, survived the lies. It survived long enough to guide him back to the person who needed him most. Elijah returned carrying a small feather he had discovered near the trees. "Ready to go?" he asked. Ethan smiled. Almost. He looked one last time at the flowers, the sunlight, and the name engraved into the stone. There would always be sadness. There would always be regret. But there would also be gratitude. And somehow, that made all the difference. Ethan stood and joined his son. Together they walked toward the parking lot beneath the golden light of late afternoon. Neither looked back. They did not need to. Because the woman they came to visit was no longer only a memory behind them. She lived in the lessons she left behind, in the family she refused to give up on, and in the quiet truth that changed everything. Sometimes justice is not found in punishment. Sometimes it is found in the chance to become the person you should have been all along.